hearing. Last week, as we were kind of running down, as hybrid school was starting for K1, we started talking about one of the issues that was coming forward was around ventilation. And lo and behold, this is a solution that the Leadership Steering Committee came forward with. And Mike Wolfe and Joel Smallwood were quickly volunteered. And what good sports they are, because here they are, ready to go. So I just want to say this is a product of all of us working collaboratively to come together and be working towards communications and the transparency of what's happening within our district. So as I was sharing earlier, one of the key things that we want to make sure that we're doing is we want to make sure to invite each of you to share your thoughts and your concerns, your ideas and your questions. But we're going to ask that we're using the Google Doc, because if it's in the chat, we're afraid it's going to get lost at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to ask Eric to kind of keep popping the chat, the document link back into the chat link, and we'll just keep doing that so that you have access. Please don't place it in the chat within the Zoom meeting because it will get lost. Time will be provided at the end for some Q&A. And what we'll do is we'll go into the questions on the Google Doc to ask, and Rita and I will help facilitate some of those questions from the Google Doc, and Mike and Joel will answer some of those questions. All right. Okay. So our purpose today, when you walk away, is to develop a better understanding of how ventilation systems work. We're not going into the weeds. Joel already agreed. Okay, we won't go there. We're going to share different types of ventilation systems within our district. And we're going to identify the type of ventilation system that is in your building. And we're going to explain how ventilation fits into the district health and safety protocols. Because we've all heard, we know with COVID-19 that ventilation is important, but then as we dig deeper, what do we really know about ventilation? So Joel and Mike have agreed they'll come and share what they know, because I'll tell you, the more we ask, the more I realize they know a lot. So first of all, thank you so much for letting us put you on the spot, invite you here tonight to say, tell us all the great things and how did we get here?
Absolutely. All right, are we ready to jump in?
We are.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to start by thanking you for setting this up and putting the invites out, Mindy. You've been really, really diligent and consistent about making sure that we get the information out. And you and I have had many conversations where you'll say things like, other people need to hear this. So this is a great opportunity for us to talk about a system that's incredibly important. It always has been, but given the fact that we're in a global pandemic, which everybody understands, and we know more today about the virus than we did a year ago. And so some of the things, so we're going to talk through some of the systems that are incredibly important, and ventilation is one of them, but I would be remiss if I didn't start with the big three, right? The big three, physical distancing, no congregating, right? Face coverings and proper hand hygiene, which means we probably have the cleanest hands in the world now, right? I mean, everybody. So those are the big three. Plus one equals four now. So that's some simple math that helps me. And the fourth one is vaccines. If you want one, guess what? In this state, you can get one. And that's a really big deal. And so ventilation, again, it's an important additional mitigation factor to reduce risk and the spread of the virus. So we're going to talk about that. And you can see this slide is really, we're going to get into the systems, how they work, the controls around the systems, and what we're doing. And I'm going to slow down long enough to let Joel jump in because I'm kind of framing up the slides. Joel's the one that's actually going to be dazzling you with the brilliance factor. It's not me. So Joel, is there anything before we jump to the next slide you want to make sure that we touch on?
No, Mike, I think that covers it. Thank you.
Well, that was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I hope to live up to your introduction there and provide some brilliance for everybody, for sure.
Yeah. No, Joel, you're awesome. Okay.
Thank you.
So we're going to get right into the types of systems, which would be the next slide. And, you know, 2 is a good number. Joel's going to talk about 2 and then the variance of 2, which is quite a few of the systems. And so it really does distill down to 2 types of systems and then how they're applied in the district. So Joel, why don't you jump in on this one?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, like Mike said, you can we could talk about this as a lot of different systems, but ultimately they come down to 2 major types: central air. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as a multi-zone system. There's a lot of different words out there that really mean the same thing. It's a central air handling system. And the second one is unit ventilators. You'll hear about those referred to different names too, univents, different names, but for the same thing. And as Mike said, you know, really in each of those are a lot of subcategories. There's just a lot of different ways to go about ventilating a building. And we have buildings that were built in the early 1900s. We have rooms that have been built and opened in the last 6 months that have yet to be used in a regular education environment. So we literally have every system that's been made for 100 years, so you could say, in our district. We've heavily modified the older systems. We've added control systems. We'll talk about those in a little while. We've added a lot of things to our systems and done a lot of work, but that's ultimately where they go to. I believe one of the next slides, you know, the next slide actually breaks our district down into kind of 3 categories of what each of the buildings have in it, to give you an idea so you can kind of focus, because I'll go into more details on what these systems do in just a couple of minutes when we get that far. But I know we wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up on what you might find in your building first. So
And I do believe that you've got that as the next slide, Mindy, where it's got the sort of the table of all of the different buildings, not just schools, but all of the buildings in our district, with the breakdown of the central, the unit vents, and how they mix together. Are you there?
I am. So
Okay.
can you see that on the screen?
I still see types of systems.
Yep.
Oh, I apologize. I have my screen. Oh, there we go. Now,
Perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah, that's perfect. And it's probably pretty small to see, but hopefully you can find yourself on here somewhere. Like I said, we really broke it down into three different types of buildings. We have the central ventilation systems, which are buildings that are, I will say, 100% or nearly 100% central systems. We'll talk about what that means in a few minutes. Then there's a group of buildings that rely on unit ventilator or versions of what we would call a unit ventilator. And then there's a larger group at the bottom where you have some of both. Many of our buildings, as you all know, have been added on to over the years. They've had several additions, many of them. And so that's where you kind of end up with this mix back and forth of systems between what kind of systems in a building. That's where we end up with central and unit ventilation at the bottom of that page.
Okay, super. And so you can see that you could be in a building like, I don't know, pick one, Joel, like North, and find yourself with multiple different systems throughout the building.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to go through the next slide with, you know, the basics of how they work. Mike, we talked about some particular schools used as examples. I think I'd like to talk about those systems as a whole and how they function before we get into the individual buildings, if we can.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found really interesting when you and I were talking earlier about, and we've been talking about this for quite a while. I mean, this is not, it's not a new topic. I mean, you went through and opened up the dampers just in time for the natural fires to kick in, right? The wildfires to kick in. And but you've described this as really kind of a pressurized cube or box.
Yeah, exactly. You could think of a building or sections of building or a classroom really as a box, and um, the this box is what we're treating the air inside that. Our ventilation system is dealing with the air inside that box. Um, what it does with that air is it takes part of that air and it exhausts it to the outside, gets rid of it out of the room. It brings in some fresh air into that room, and the systems do that differently, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes when we get into those specific systems. But that's really what it's all about: is removing air, bringing in fresh air, and then tempering that air, bringing it up to temperature, keeping the room warm, keeping the room cool if there's cooling in the school, or if the outside air is cold enough outside that it can provide some cooling into the space, it uses it in that function. At the same time, there are filtration systems in these units. They were originally designed mostly to protect the unit itself, to keep the ductwork clean if you have ductwork, and to keep the heating coils and cooling coils clean so they would operate at maximum efficiency. That was the primary purpose of filtration in systems. Obviously, it does a lot more than that, especially as filters have continued to improve and change over the years since the early 30s, let's say, when we had a lot of these that were doing different things. And as I mentioned, it conditions the air, heats it, cools it, and then ultimately delivers it to that box in different ways, depending on what kind of system it is. So that's using the box analogy is the best way that we're probably going to be able to walk through that. Some of you are in an individual box that's all by itself, and some of you are in small boxes inside a much larger box that's a huge portion of your building or a big portion of your building. So that's where we end up with the very variations in there.
Hey, Joel,
Yeah.
I've got a question.
Go for it.
So these systems are really designed to move air, right? I mean, that's one of the main features, is to move it. So how many times per hour typically are we talking about, like the refresh rate, or cycling through?
Yeah, it averages 3 to 4 times an hour, Mike, across our district. There's some variation in there. Every system's a little different, and it does depend on the pressurization we talked about earlier, the settings of the system. But on average, it's 3 to 4 times an hour. And you're right, the whole purpose of these things is to move air, and while doing it, replace some of that air with fresh outside air. So it's not just moving the air around your room. That's, I guess, a really important thing to understand about ventilation, and the whole idea behind it is it's not just taking air in your room and making it run in circles around your room and stay there. It is designed differently. And most home systems do what we just talked about, what I just mentioned, and that is take the air that you have and just move it around your house and reheat it. That's where a commercial system, or a system like we have in our schools, is far different from anything that you would find in a normal house, because they don't usually pull in fresh outside air into the system. So very different systems.
Right. And they're huge investments too. And just before we dive into the systems a little deeper, we had a 2008 bond, and that ended up being a little over $262 million worth of investments. And the single most system invested in the 2008 bond was HVAC.
Yeah.
And in our 2018 bond, when it's all said and done, I predict it'll be over an $800 million bond. And when you're building new spaces or enhancing spaces, that the HVAC system is one of the major components in that investment as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, in the new spaces, is new modern systems that, are a requirement of building the new areas, the new construction for sure. So we're putting a lot of investment in there. But additionally, in the existing buildings, we're investing tens of millions of dollars across the district. That number could easily be $100 million by the time we're done in our HVAC systems and in our control systems that operate and control those. So absolutely, it's a huge investment, and we continue to evaluate our systems and look for opportunities to invest in them where they make sense, especially in the schools that we're touching with the bond work, which is every school in the district, and every site in the district.
No, that's great. And so we're going to transition into, you're going to start talking about the central systems themselves, and then how they work specifically, and then move into the univentilators.
Yeah, and then I'll bring I think a transition from there, Mike, into the three kind of example schools that we want to talk about today. So absolutely.
Okay, so we're ready for the next slide.
There we
Central
go.
systems. Now, this is where you're going to take that pressurized box and sort of talk about how it works within the box, right?
Yep, absolutely. And I live and breathe this stuff sometimes too much, so I can get a little bit into the weeds. Sometimes Mike has to slow me down a little bit and say, just give me what I need to know here. I could talk about central air systems for probably hours, maybe days. There are people on our team in the district who could talk about them even in much greater detail than I can. They're all of our systems are very complex. This is one of the most complex systems that we have in all of our operations. When we look at fire alarms and every other kind of system that we manage in facilities, a central or zones heating and cooling system, ventilation system is by far the most complex. What this is it's a large air handler that usually is in a mechanical space, which means it's up in the attic in a big room, or behind one of those doors that says mechanical room that you never get to look through, might be in a basement. It can be a lot of places, but these units are fairly large. Think of something that would fill up a normal sized living room or kitchen at a house, at your home. They're big units, sometimes larger than that. They serve multiple areas or multiple zones inside a building. So if you have one of these units, it's central to a group of boxes. So it serves this box that might be a quarter, a third, a half of a building, depends on the size of the building and the size of the unit. And then inside that are your individual rooms or individual spaces that are boxes inside that big box. So they, like I say, they're very complex. They measure literally hundreds of data points around the building. We have some of our systems at our high schools that are monitoring well over 1,000 data points continuously. So this doesn't require someone to be there, someone to be looking at it. These are automated systems, direct digital control systems that we monitor the system and we check it to make sure everything's going well, but we don't have to be in it all the time. They're doing this, like I say, thousands of times an hour. They are monitoring this system internally into it. So it monitors all kinds of things. It monitors individual room temperatures, so individual boxes inside the big box. It monitors CO2 levels. Usually that happens in the ductwork that leads to and from the system. It monitors the different zones in the system individually. It monitors outside air, monitors humidity outside the room, or outside the building rather. It pulling in a whole bunch of data. It also monitors several different points inside that unit ventilator, or rather that central system, that big air handler I talked about. There's multiple points inside that box that it's monitoring. And ultimately what it's doing is it's taking all of those pieces of information and deciding what's next. What should we do to make the rooms comfortable up to temperature, to make sure we have proper airflow, the right amount of airflow, and that we're mixing outside air in with that. So these systems, I'll kind of walk through the flow of traffic, if you will, the flow of air in and out of this box. So this central unit pulls air out of each of the small boxes inside that area. So each classroom pulls air back into the system. It takes part of that air, it exhausts it to the outside world. And at the same time, through a different ductwork, it's pulling in fresh outside air into that unit. It takes that air that now is outside air with what's left of the already air that was inside. It mixes that air together and it runs it through a filter deck that's inside this system. It filters the air. These filters, like I say, catch a lot of things. They catch, pollen, and they catch all dirt and dust, both from the outside air and the inside air. It runs that through the system, and then runs it through a set of coils to heat it or cool that air, and then delivers it out through ductwork to each room or each zone inside that area. It delivers the air in. At each room, there are typically is another heating device right before it goes into the room to reheat that air, because this unit, remember, is serving, let's say, 10 classrooms, and some of those rooms might need heat, some might not need so much heat. So it, in the main air handler, is setting those parameters for what will satisfy most of the rooms, and then taking care of what each individual room needs right at the point of delivery into the room. And air comes in, returns back, and the cycle continues. One of the beauties of these systems, Mike, is they are the mechanical equipment is remote, so they're very quiet. In most cases, you don't know they're running. Typically, if you do know they're running, something's wrong, because they shouldn't be making noise. It shouldn't feel like a windstorm inside the room. So that's one of the bright sides and downsides of it, because oftentimes people think they're not operating when they indeed usually are. So
what you're saying is the systems are working. I mean, if there's power in a building, the systems are working.
yes.
Whether you can hear it or feel it or not.
Yeah, and we monitor that frequently. That's part of our process, is to monitor frequently to ensure they are. There are always, the opportunities for mechanical breakdown. Something can go wrong and a unit can stop. We have a process for dealing with those. HVAC is always a priority. Pre-COVID, it's a huge priority to make sure rooms aren't cold. That's a big deal. It's hard to teach in a room with that's 58 degrees, and so it's always a priority. And now it's even more so of a priority, because it's not just a temperature thing. It's a ventilation issue for the building. So absolutely.
Okay. All right. Anything else on central systems before we jump into the unit ventilators?
Well, I'd just like to say that outside air that we talked about, that it pulls in, there is those settings have a minimum amount of outside air that we're required by law to bring into our buildings, and that's existed way before COVID. So that's always been a requirement of these systems, is that they do bring in outside air all the time. And then as temperatures increase or CO2 increases, things like that inside the building, that will modulate to even more outside air. Mm-hmm. So we can bring in a lot of outside air in these systems. Now, one might say, why not bring in all the outside air? Why not bring it all in? The problem with that is the outside air is usually too cold for that, and we can't keep up with it. Our boiler systems and these heat coils that are in here can't keep up. So we would a room would just continue to get colder and colder as the day went along. The harder it worked, the colder it would get. And of course, anytime we're down around freezing, anywhere near freezing, we run the risk of a catastrophic damage to our systems. Many of these systems have water pipes running through them. Water coils look a lot like a radiator in a car, only they're huge. And we could freeze those up easily when they thaw out. First of all, not only would they no longer work, but they would be flooding the buildings. It would would be very catastrophic to our buildings to freeze up one of these systems. So we have to monitor, regulate that. And these systems, that's part of what they watch all the time, is what's the outside air temperature, what's the temperature inside this unit, to protect themselves from that catastrophic damage. So it is definitely a balancing, but the idea is that we bring in as much outside air as we possibly can, protect the systems, and keep the rooms up to temperature all at the same time. Bit of a balancing act there, Mike.
Okay, no, that's perfect. And then one last thing before we slide over to the next, the unit ventilators. So when you say monitoring CO2, that means when there's more people in the building, the system reacts to that.
Yes, absolutely, it does. And with our small groups that we have in here, that will obviously just automatically help with CO2, but our systems monitor that normally.
Perfect.
Most of our systems, yeah.
Okay, on to unit ventilators.
Yeah. So unit ventilators, these are a unit does virtually the same thing as what we just talked about with our central systems. The only thing is it serves an individual space. So instead of serving a bunch of boxes in a big box like the other systems, this is just serving a box, typically a classroom. It can be, you'll see these sometimes in some other small spaces, mid-sized spaces, but generally it's a classroom. This one is a bit of a challenge to know whether you have it or not. There are a lot of you in the district, a lot of folks in the district who have one of these in their rooms and they know it all too well. They are usually sitting underneath the window in a classroom. They're a box that has a grate on top of it, and there's a fan running inside of it. And if you have one, you know it because you can feel the air blowing out of it. If you walk anywhere near it, you feel like it's freezing you because it's blowing so much air, and you can hear it. It's in your room. Now that describes probably about 75% of our systems that fall into this unit ventilator category. There are some of our buildings that have a system that works like this, so it just serves one particular area, but the actual fan unit is mounted in the attic or on the rooftop in some cases. So it starts to get a little bit confusing on these of if you don't see a box in your room, do you have a univent or do you have a central system? The answer could be yes to one or the other. There aren't as many of these out there that are, like I say, up in the attic or up on top of a rooftop. So generally you're on a central system or you have that in-room unit ventilator, but they do really about the same thing. They pull air back into these units. They do bring in outside air in those units that are under your windows. They mix the two together. They filter it in that unit. They then run it through a set of heat coils, warm that air up, and the air that comes out of the top of it into the room is your made up air and your tempered air coming in. They typically don't exhaust air right in that unit. We talked about the central systems earlier, those big boxes that they actually push air straight outside the room. Typically on these unit ventilators, it relies on another damper, an exhaust damper in the room. There's, we call them relief dampers. They're typically a vent in the ceiling that has, some have fans in them, some don't, but they actually pull air out of the room and they are tied to that unit ventilator. So the unit ventilator, back to the minimum outside air, they adjust air, how much air they're bringing in as well, just like the big systems do. And at the same time, that exhaust air damper is moving with it to allow air to move out of the space as well. Really much simpler systems. They still are on our direct digital control systems. So we can control these, we can see what they're doing, we can monitor these in most all cases, just like we can a central system. They're just not as sophisticated or as complicated, to be honest about it. Much simpler systems.
Okay, and there's one other, it's not an HVAC system, but it's many people may remember a few years back, we installed a bunch
Mhm.
of wall-mounted AC units. They're typically up by the ceiling, and they went into libraries and computer labs and maybe some other areas, but they're not really a ventilation system, are they?
Yeah, you're correct, Mike. They're what we call a mini split. They're an air conditioner. Um, as you mentioned, Mike, they were put into a lot of computer labs in the portions of libraries that were used for computer labs, and in the standalone computer labs around the district. We have them in a few other places. A few special needs programs have them in their rooms. They're a unit. You see them in use quite a bit around the world, other places, doctors' offices. I've seen them all kinds of places, but they're a small unit that hangs up on the wall. They're about 3 feet long and maybe a foot tall. They are purely a standalone air conditioner that is just taking air from inside that room, cooling it down and pushing it back inside that room. They have no filtration. They have no outside air, and they are standalone for the most part. So if it's cycling off and on throughout the day, that's totally independent of the ventilation system. The ventilation system is still running. That air conditioner is simply cycling off and on because it doesn't need to cool the space anymore. The space is cooled down. We have quite a few of these in some of our hearing impaired classrooms at Salem Heights, for instance, because we couldn't open windows and cool them down. So we needed a system that was quieter and provided cooling in their space. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So we talked about the two major systems, central and unit ventilators. Ventilators. You know what I'm
Yeah,
talking about. Anyways, and before we get on to the next slide, you're actually not going to talk about algorithms, are you?
I'm not going to get deep into them. And before we get there, though, I'd like to talk about three kind of example schools that
Oh yeah.
we
Yeah.
get that we have out there. Yeah, yeah. I won't go into algorithms, although hopefully there's a math teacher or two on here. Um, so some of our schools are very similar to each other. We have a lot of these pod schools that are. Some of them are almost identical. Some are really, really similar to each other. Our middle schools kind of fall into that category. We've got the Stevens and Houks of the world. So I want to kind of run through that just so people, to give you an idea of what you have, and it probably applies to your building. So Yoshikai is one of our pod schools, has three major classroom pods, an admin, music room, gymnasium area. Yoshikai is one of our buildings that is exclusively on the central system, so the central HVAC systems. It has 4 big units that run that entire school. So that gives you an idea when we start talking about the big box. There are 4 big boxes at Yoshikai that have a big air handler on them. In each of those, there are multiple zones, multiple rooms that feed into that. So that building is on our direct digital control system, so we can monitor it from anywhere. We can monitor it anywhere we have an internet connection. We can pull up that system. We don't have to be in the building. We don't have to be here in central services in the maintenance shop to do that. We can look at it from anywhere. So it's kind of an example of a building that still hasn't been added onto. We're getting ready to it with this bond, but it hasn't been added on to today. So it doesn't have a bunch of mixed systems. It's pretty well put together. Houck Middle School is another example I'd like to talk about. It's Houck and Stevens are I believe identical, really close to identical anyway, and others out there are close to that. Houck is almost all on a central system. It has several big units in that building. I didn't get a chance to count them up on the plans exactly, but it has several of these big central units that serve most of that building. But it does have some areas of the building served by something that would be more like the univents. In that particular building, it's things like the entry hallway has a standalone system. It's either on the attic or in the roof, so you don't see it in the room, but it is not hooked to the big central system in their main entryway. There's some other other areas of the building that are served that way as well. It is also on our DDC system, so we can control it from anywhere But those, like I say, those individual small areas are not connected directly to the big central systems that serve the majority of that building. And then we have buildings that I'm going to talk about. North Salem High School. It's a good example that really would somewhat mirror a lot of our buildings out there. It's a real mix. North Salem High School has been added onto, I believe, 11 times, might be 12 now. We might have just done the 12th edition at North. With the most recent edition, we did tear down several of the old editions, so it's not nearly as many buildings as it might sound like, but it's one of our oldest buildings. It has some of our oldest systems in it, and of course, it has a couple of new wings on it and new gymnasium that have our newest equipment in it. It's a building that really hasn't been occupied, fully at all since it's been opened up after construction. So North has those central systems on the newer portions of the building. All of the new building that we just added is on central systems. There was a wing on the north end of North Salem High School that was added, I believe in the late 90s, early 2000s, that also has a central type system. Then when you get into the old building or into the original portions of that building, is kind of a mix of the two. We have a central system that provides air, but doesn't provide any heat. It just is moving air. It's exhausting air. It's bringing in fresh air, but it doesn't heat it up at all. Some of the rooms there are still relying on radiant heat. So when you go into them, they might look like an old radiator sitting there that just has hot coming off of it. Some of those are in the attic, so you don't actually see them. But many of the unit or many of the rooms that are just provided with air through the ductwork, through plenums that are underneath the building and over the top of the building. So it's a real mixed bag at North. But what I can tell you about North is all areas of that building are ventilated. So they're all connected to some form of a system that fits into one of those two, either unit vent or central type system that provides fresh air into those rooms, provides that changeover of air into the rooms at that 3 to 4 times an hour that we talked about. So, okay. Yeah, and that's all on that. I was gonna jump into pressures, but that's a little bit later, Mike, into the controls here. So
why don't you weave that into the algorithms conversation on this slide?
I will. So.
Yeah. So we have these systems in place. I think we have hopefully we have a better understanding of what they do, where they are throughout the district. Now you're going to talk about how do you control them, and basically how does the network help with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where I can really get deep on you a little bit, so I'll be cautious for everybody. First of all, we have local controls. It is exactly like it sounds. It's a local control system that we really don't have a way to get into unless we go on site and hook a laptop to it or hook another device to it and see what's going on there. That typically exists in our portable classrooms. You'll see it's a programmable thermostat sits on the wall, probably looks a lot like what you might have at home if you have a programmable thermostat. It is a little more advanced than what you would have at home because it's like a mini control system in it. What I talked about, that it's measuring temperatures and all of that in the buildings, it does a lot of that. And it does control how much outside air it's bringing into the building, how much it's not in most of those cases. So they're local. They're time consuming from a maintenance standpoint in that to go out and make a change in their programming, to change timing of the systems means we have to go to each and every one of them. And like I say, mostly those are in portable classrooms, but there are some other areas that they've been deployed around the district. Then the next one down that we have there is our digital control systems, direct digital controls. We have those in most buildings now. We continue to expand that network with our bond work. That's one of the places we're putting some of our investment in this bond. Certainly was a large expansion in the last bond, expanding our control systems. And what that does, it works through the district's network, our internal network, but they are servers that we can get to all that information from anywhere. So we don't have to be inside the network to get to it, but ultimately they all tie together through our network and we control what's happening in each building. As I mentioned earlier, they monitor a lot of data points. They use complex algorithms, Mike, to control the systems, and they're centrally operated. We have a space out here in the maintenance that has someone at it all the time, several big monitors, they can watch it. And then we have our controls team on our HVAC team that's out all the time monitoring these things and checking them, a lot of times on site with their laptop, doing the work to see how they're operating and to make any adjustments that may need to be there. I'm going to talk a little bit about pressure in the building. It's partly on the next slide as well, with the windows and doors and pressures and how this system talks to itself as well, and what confuses it and what doesn't work well for it. So these systems rely on pressure inside a building, inside that box that we talked about, to know. It's just one of the major pieces of data that they rely on. And if that pressure drops, the fans inside these units speed up, because it's assuming that it's not delivering the proper volume of air to spaces because there's no pressure. So it continues to turn up the speed on these fans to build that pressure. And then as the pressure gets too high, it'll slow things down a little bit. So that's one of the big data points that comes into this. Obviously, temperature, humidity, CO2, and temperatures in individual spaces come into play pretty heavily on that. As I was mentioning earlier, they monitor thousands of points. This is a pretty complex system that's using all of that data to drive to a decision for what's next in the system.
Okay, and that leads us to fans, doors, and windows.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump into the first two, and then what you just talked about around systems and how they monitor thousands of data points and how they can get confused. One of the things I want to make sure everybody understands is, even though we are very interested in increasing airflow and fresh air into our buildings, we still have to maintain a security posture no different than when it was pre-COVID. So in other words, pod schools or schools where you've got exterior doors in classrooms, we're still not going to open those doors. Okay. That we're just not going to do that, because from a security standpoint, that's the higher risk. Or ground floor windows wide open. We'll have to really be careful about that. The other thing to remember too, not just from a security standpoint, is allergies are a real thing. Allergens haven't gone away just because the weather's getting better. In fact, this is usually the season where there are a lot of people affected by that. So this is really a trade-off for us, and it's a risk trade-off that we have to be very careful about. But we're not at a point as a district where we're saying to, let's say you use Yoshkai as an example, go ahead and open up all your classroom doors and, wedge them open. One, that's an unrealistic risk to take from a security standpoint. And two, as Joel just described, you don't need to do that. The systems are working, to make sure that that's not needed. And so I just wanted to touch bases on that. And then Joel, why don't you take it from there? If there's anything else you wanted to add around the top two bullets, please jump in.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, on the allergy side, our filtration systems do catch pollen and dust and dander and all of that. So letting the air come in to the space through the ventilation system ensures that it's had the opportunity to do that. Bringing air in through an open window guarantees you that it hasn't happened until the first time it makes it loop through that air handler. So that'd be a big one there. Back to the kind of the confusion of the DDC, I mentioned earlier that it relies on pressure. So opening doors and opening windows is going to cause that system to overspeed, to speed up trying to build pressure in the building. What that's going to result in is noise. You're going to hear it, you're going to feel it, and temperature control issues, because these systems are designed to overcome certain amounts of temperature change in that air that they're moving. And if we get too great of an exchange, they can't keep up. So you're never going to get the room warm. And with all of that added air movement, it's kind of the wind chill factor inside your room. It might be 68 degrees in your room, and that vent might be pushing out air that's even warmer than that. But when it's moving such a large volume of air, it's going to feel like it's blowing cold air on you. You're going to have a wind chill effect if you're near or under one of those vents. So it just causes a lot of issues there. The other one is if you're on one of these central systems, so you're a box tied to a bunch of other boxes under this air handler, and you open all of your windows, the system sees that one room is cold. Let's say it's cold outside and you do this. It can see that a room is cold, and it tries to compensate for that room being cold and can overheat all of the others, or vice versa. It can work the other way as well. If it sees one room hot, it tries to cool your room and makes everybody else freeze. So it just causes a lot of issues with the balancing of the systems. These systems are designed by engineers and designed to operate in that closed box and to operate efficiently and to meet all the requirements. As soon as we start opening that box up, it just throws all of that balancing and work out the window, and it struggles to keep up with what your needs are in a room. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So we can, by definition, we are purposefully confusing our systems to a certain degree, and we get that. And you and your staff are monitoring all of the systems to make sure that we're not going too far with respect. I mean, you'll see one running really hard, and then that'll be a red flag to you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the other thing it can cause is some dispatching of resources to go out to a problem that's not necessarily a problem. If we see that cold room on our computer system, we might assume there's something wrong in the room. When we get out there, there's a window open. Or like you say, if a system is ramped way up and running at high speed, we can't tell why from here. We unfortunately can't monitor the windows from here. So we end up sending someone out to look at it to try to figure out why is the system doing what it's doing, because it won't tell us everything for sure. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I think we're ready to kind of wrap this segment up with the next slide, which is kind of what we're doing. And this is hopefully informative to a lot of people that may wonder what happens at night, and some other things that happen by you and your staff. So why don't you walk us through how you've adjusted the systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've made multiple adjustments to the systems since COVID started. One of the major adjustments we made was late last summer, early fall, when we were hopeful that we were going to have people back in the rooms, and we were bringing people back there for a while on a limited amount and things. We opened up, we forced more outside air into our buildings. And as Mike talked about really early on, we then had a bunch of wildfires that sent a lot of people home. and sent a lot of smoke inside our building. We were basically pumping the air that you have outside in our buildings, and causes a lot of issues. So we had to back off on that for a while. And then wintertime got here, so we had to back off back to a minimum setting, if you will, on that outside air. Still bringing in outside air to meet code, to meet the requirements of the buildings. We're actually a little above what our absolute minimum could be on outside air right now. We're looking forward to some warmer weather for a lot of reasons, so we can all go out and have a little fun in it. But then also so we can start to adjust that minimum outside air up and not run the risk of catastrophic damage to our systems or cold rooms that we can't keep warm. So those are some of the adjustments we've made. We're continuously monitoring. Like I say, there's a team of folks that their job is to watch these systems and see what they're doing. And if they detect a problem, we have other folks that can go out and take a look at that problem, try to troubleshoot it, or our controls guys can go out there themselves and take a look at these things. We can, like I say, oftentimes see a problem on the system. Sometimes we can fix a problem on the system, but oftentimes we do have to go on site to take a look and get more information than we can get from our system. So we're continuously monitoring, we're inspecting on a frequent basis, we're repairing systems anytime there's a problem, anytime something's wrong, and just ensuring that they're operating as designed. I talked earlier about that there's a lot of engineering and design work that goes into these systems, and if we run them and keep them operating the way they were supposed to, our air will be moved the way it's supposed to be, and we'll be in a good place with our ventilation. We've also extended the hours of operation. That's one of the recommendations out of CDC and others out there. Currently, we're running our systems from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Across the district. That's once again a scheduling piece that we have to go through all of our systems and make that change. Our standalone systems, we have to go into each of one of those, connect to those thermostats, and change the schedule in them every time we make an adjustment there. So it can be a bit time consuming for those, but we make it through those. We do that when we need to. We're also figuring more frequent filter inspections we're already doing, and then more frequent replacements we're highly anticipating. Anytime the filters really have a lifetime in them based on how much they operate and outside air conditions and how much dust and all of that there is in the air. So these inspections are certainly going to lead us to more frequent replacements, because we're simply running the systems harder than normal for more hours than normal, forcing more outside air, all of the things that lead to filters needing to be replaced on a more frequent basis, we're doing in an effort to provide the best ventilation we possibly can into the building. And then what we call a night flush. And I say where possible. Many of our systems are capable of doing this, not all of them, but that's really what it sounds just like it sounds there. The ventilation system turns on, it's pulling in outside air, it doesn't heat it, it doesn't do anything to it, it just brings in outside air and exhausts air. The problem with that is we have to be really cautious with that, because once again, it will damage our systems if it freezes them up. The other thing is we can't get the rooms too terribly cold at night, because if we start off, if we do a night flush and we cool a room all the way down into the low 50s and then turn on that system at 6 in the morning, it won't be warm when everybody gets here. It'll take way too long for that building to recover. So as our nights start to warm up, as we move into spring here, we'll be able to do more night flushing for longer periods of time. For right now, we have to keep that fairly minimalistic in order to keep the buildings warm. But we certainly are working those systems to do that and to basically clear them out. And that's the whole idea of the extended hours running from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. is to have that an additional morning clear out before everybody gets there, but it is heating the air at that point, bringing it up to temperature. And then at the end of the day, to let that thing run for, in many cases, several hours after people are gone, depends on release times for everybody, but for hours after the large groups of people are in the building, so we can clear that air out and start over fresh.
So Joel, you had just a quick question. You have mentioned quite a few times that there's like a minimum amount of air intake, is there a percent that you could say of fresh air coming in that is the minimum?
Yeah, generally, Mike, the minimum is 15% of the air coming through a system has to be fresh outside air. We currently have our system set at 20.
Okay.
We did go to 15 for a while over the winter when we were having really cold temperatures. We've adjusted that up, and we have adjusted that much higher when we were back in some of the early days when we were learning a lot about COVID and when we were learning a lot about the fires that we didn't know about yet. We had it up as high as 50%, I believe. I believe we were running as high as 50% at one point, but that was much warmer weather, and then the smoke bit us on that one for sure.
Right, right. But you could see, as the temperatures rise and we get closer, to kind of summer, you probably see that going up from 20% to some number, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll incrementally increase that as we move into spring. On the other end of that, we will probably have to incrementally decrease that as we approach summer. So when we start getting into, let's say, late May, early June, we kind of run into the same problems with cold, but with hot. If it's 85 or 90 degrees outside and we're pulling in 50% outside air, your room's just going to continue to heat up all day until it gets to however hot it is outside, which we deal with enough without forcing the problem. So it's a real balance between all of these things, between protecting the system, making the building comfortable for people to learn in, because you have to have the right temperature to teach and learn in, and then at the same time providing that fresh air exchange, that air turnover that we talk about so much around COVID.
Yeah. Well, Mindy, this is the end of our formal presentation, and I just want to acknowledge Joel as the system expert for the district, and he's been able to guide us through HVAC 101, maybe 201, maybe 301, maybe 401, depending on where you were on the scale before we started.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Excellent. That's a lot of information and we appreciate it. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and put into the chat the link for the Google Doc. And both Joel and Michael, I'm going to have you click on that link as well so you can see the questions and some of the comments. There's two different tabs at the bottom. There's both the issues and concerns from building specifically, but then there's also a questions page.
Okay.
And, people were really great at some of those questions. And so just right out of the, as we start off, I'm going to let the two of you kind of just bounce through this and choose the questions that you want to answer right out of the gates.
Okay. So Joel, which tab do you want to start with?
Well, I have the issues and concerns tab open right now.
Okay.
Now that I have open. So I'll jump in there, Mike, on that. I'll just start at the top one from Sprague around air purification and HEPA filtration systems and purchasing them with ASB funds. At this point, we are not, we're asking that people don't do that. The reason is the district is purchasing HEPA filtration systems. We have a decision matrix that we're using to purchase those systems for our higher risk areas, and that is part of the recommendation out of the RSSL and CDC and others, is to evaluate our systems, evaluate our spaces continuously, and use what we can, what's available to us to improve those areas. So we've certainly done that. But part of that is when we purchase one, we also have to be prepared to maintain it. And we have to be prepared to change the filters in it on a frequent basis, make sure that it's operational and all of that. So the ones that have been purchased thus far have been purchased by district funds and will be maintained by the district. We have a tracking system. We know where they're all at. I ask that if you have those in your room, don't move them out of your room, because that will cause us to hunt around looking for them. They're supposed to be in all the right spaces. And we have a bunch out there, mostly in SPED rooms right now. Our COVID isolation rooms, we're deploying those. We don't have them all out yet. We've been getting shipments of them as we can. And we're putting those in staff lunchrooms, staff break rooms, and in front offices, just because of the higher risk nature of all of those spaces with the revolving number of people coming into them and the work that's happening, especially in our SPED rooms. It just met the criteria for that. So back to the original question here of using ASB funds to purchase it. Right now, we haven't been allowing schools to purchase their own, mostly for that tracking and maintenance and upkeep piece. Because if they do that, we have no idea where they're at. What I can almost guarantee is they won't have their filters changed because no one knows they exist beyond the school. We have all, but at the same time, though, changed our posture a little bit around people bringing in their own systems. If someone has one and they want to bring it into their classroom, a personal device, we have said that we will allow that, but we want to make it really clear, we're not going to maintain it. We're not going to change the filters in it. That's a personal device that a person can bring in if they choose to.
Yeah, and just on the, so to reiterate, the answer is no. Number one, we're not these HEPA air filtration systems are a district resource with a district criteria to determine where they go. So it's not up to, it's not open for any department or school to buy them. And we won't allow that regardless of the use of funds at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And, someone just threw a comment in there too about the equity thing. We're concerned with, some schools that don't have ASB funds to pay for HEPA filters as well. That's just another added layer to that. But yeah, that's the answer on that. I see some questions in here, or actually comments in here, and I saw some on the other side around North Salem in particular. So Carrie put in here that her room has a radiator, has one of those old radiant heaters. So once again, there is a system in that building that circulates the air around the building and exhausts some of that air outside the building, brings in fresh air and recirculates it. It's through what we call a plenum, which is a fancy way to say a duct that runs under the building, actually at North Salem runs underneath the hallway down on the main floor. There's a huge tunnel of sorts that runs through there. It's not the kind of tunnel that kids talk about and read about with all the scary things in it. It's really not exciting at all, just a big concrete box. So anyway, we run air through that building that comes into those spaces so that they are getting fresh air. And yeah, there are still a lot of spaces in the older portion of North that have the old radiators in those.
Joel, yes. I'm just going to say, I see a question here about the portables. Can you address the ventilation and air systems in portables and what they're doing to increase the airflow and filtration systems?
Yeah, the portables typically have a unit, 1 unit per classroom. So there's usually one hanging on each end of that portable. Sometimes they're both mounted on one end. But anyway, that unit serves just that room. And it does have the ability to bring in fresh outside air and exhaust air out of that unit as well. Portables are one of our spaces that generally have air conditioning, just because those systems have heating and air conditioning capabilities in portables. So they work really, they would closely mirror what we would talk about as a unit ventilator that we talked about in many of our buildings. They're just mounted on the outside of the wall with a duct that comes through the wall, pulling air into them, and usually they provide the air back into the space through vents in the ceiling tiles back into each space. And they are on those local controlled systems that I talked about with the thermostats in each space. That's typically what we see in portables. So.
Okay. I see that Rachel Ryan has a question from Leslie about their HVAC system has been fixed several times in the past with no discernible difference in classrooms. After leaving springtime classroom temperatures in the 90s, what's different this time? That's line 11.
Line 11. Click on the right place here. I don't know the particulars of Leslie. I'd have to look deeper into that. I don't believe Leslie has air conditioning, which is part of why we end up with rooms in the 90s. We have a lot of our buildings that don't have air conditioning. Most of them don't. So what we run into there is they are going to grow, the temperature is going to rise in those rooms as the day goes, as long as the outside air heats up. And then of course, as we add bodies to it, that just increases that even more, because bring a bunch of hot people in there, it just continues to rise the temperature. So would have to look into that school a little more in particular, as far as the fix several times with no discernible difference. I don't know what they were fixing at the time. As far as if it's just operating in ventilation, it wouldn't necessarily be a discernible difference.
Okay.
So.
And Rachel, are you adding more to this? If so, you can clarify, that would be helpful.
Okay.
I did add more to that. Just thinking about the fact that now, if we don't have a cooling system and it's getting to those temperatures in our classrooms and staff and students are wearing masks, what sort of heating, ventilating, cooling options do we have for health and safety?
Okay, so that is something that I had actually put on my list. So we will bring that to the steering committee, because that unfortunately is out of Joel's hands. So thanks, Rachel. I think that's something that definitely I had put in my mind too, as well. Thanks. All right. There definitely was a comment. Sean, you have put a lot of great questions into this that we're going to have to dive into deeper. Do you have one in particular that you would like answered?
I did. I put it at the top actually because I wanted it, because I realized I was going through and going, oh, really? There's only one question I want to ask. It's what line is it? Let me look. Hold on a second. Yes, it is line number 3. Yeah, go ahead. That's fine.
Do you want to ask it? I'll let you ask it.
I'd love to. No, it sounds better coming from you.
Okay. All right. So how can we know the particulate matter, carbon dioxide levels, and if our filtration that was recently installed actually helps with COVID?
Yeah. So we're talking about some very different things here: particulate matter and carbon dioxide versus COVID. So if we went in there, when you ask the question, how do we know the particulate matter? The only way to know that would be to do an air sampling and air quality assessment of the building, and it would tell us about particulates in the air, be it dust, pollen, mold spores. There's all kinds of things they can look for, but one of them, to my knowledge, there's no way to say there's COVID in the air or not. I don't know of any particulate test. So we could tell you that, but it wouldn't really tell you anything about ventilation and about COVID in our buildings. The same thing with the carbon dioxide. Really, carbon dioxide is just a formula of how many people are breathing in the room, how much fresh air you're bringing in, and how much air you're getting rid of. Because if we go in and adjust one of these systems and quit bringing in outside air, we can watch that carbon dioxide rise in a room pretty rapidly when you start putting 20, 30 bodies in that room breathing. So just knowing that the outside air damper is open and is pulling in outside air is going to drive that down. Many of our systems, we do monitor that. Our systems, that's one of another key data point that they use to decide how much outside air they need to bring in is carbon dioxide, because we've got to keep people awake and keep people alert in our buildings, and there's code requirements around that with our modern systems. So and the filtration system, that was the recent stuff that was put in your building, wasn't put in, filters weren't put in specifically for COVID. They were put in just like they are everywhere else in our buildings, to provide filtration for the ventilation of the building. So what I would say is the ventilation system is helping with COVID, in that you have a really nice modern one that we know is working well, just like all of the old ones that we know are working well. But the ventilation system, bringing in outside air and exhausting air, is how we help with COVID. And as we talked about very early in this conversation, it's one of many things stacked on top of each other around to help with this. Hand washing, face coverings, social distancing, are far and above ventilation when it comes to preventing COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I learned a lot more after posting my questions. So actually, that was one question I really wanted. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
That's fantastic. So then I'm going to move right over to Lisa Hardy. And the question that I've already asked multiple times of Mike, and I just keep coming back to it. And then I go to Ethan as well, because I just like to ask multiple people the same question and just keep saying. So now it's your turn, Joel. This is about our larger areas and common spaces, just within our high schools and our middle schools, and the ventilation, and how are we ensuring that ventilation is working, and as we're putting in multiple cohorts within that space. I see you studying ahead of me.
Yeah, reading it there.
I saw that.
Great question. So,
isn't it? It's a good question.
Well, one thing is, I see you mentioned in there, someone said to put a damp paper towel on the thermostat so the heat will come on. Yeah, that's a proven effective and ineffective method. How's that? I would encourage you don't do that.
Yeah,
It does throw the system for a loop.
Not to bring the hair dryer and shine and like
Yep.
point it at the little silver. Yeah, I've heard that. That's a no-go as well. I've
That's
heard not to like breathe on your hands and cover it. That's a no-go. Yeah.
An ice pack taped to it.
I've heard that's not to do that as well.
All of those things. So ultimately, if those things are very temporary, maybe fixes.
And they throw the box. We don't want to throw the box.
Yeah, and it could cause you a lot more problems down the road, or cause others problems. So really, the answer to that is, if you have a situation like that where you feel like you need to put an ice pack or a wet paper towel on the thermostat, let your office manager know, let your administrator know. They can reach out to our hot and cold desk. We have staff that monitor that all day. That's what their job is. And we will go out and take a look at it. In many cases, there's something we can do, and that's what we have to know. And if you continue every day to put an ice pack on it, we'll never know that you have a problem. We may see it in our control system, but just remember this: if you have an ice pack on your thermostat, that's what we're going to see. So we're going to think the room may be perfectly fine, depending on how old the ice pack is. We might, when we happen to hit it. So try to avoid that. I would appreciate that, and let us know. We can come out and look. There are times where we're not going to be able to do anything about it. When we start talking about hot spaces, if it's 90 degrees outside, there's not a lot we can do to control temperature. What we do in those times, though, is we start our systems earlier in the day. Early, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. This is just during non-COVID times. That has nothing to do with COVID, but we try to cool out those buildings as much as we can. That always comes at a cost too. We get the calls at 7 o'clock in the morning of my room's cold, and we're like, yeah, it's going to be 95 degrees. You'll be fine in a little while, because if we start that room at 70 degrees, you're going to be at 90 even quicker. So it's it is a challenge. The one room hot, the next freezing. We need to know about those things. That's what our hot and cold desk call line is for. We also have a work order system that your office managers all have access to. And we certainly need to know. We monitor a lot of things. We talked about that earlier, and our control systems let us see deep into these things, but we can't see it all. People in the rooms are often, have great information about what's happening as well. So we want to hear it. And then a space that you mentioned also kind of at the end, a large room like the library that's completely enclosed and adequate ventilation. It's part of a system, probably part of one of these larger central systems. I don't know if it's Sprague in particular, could be one of the unit ventilators that's in the attic or on top of the roof, but it does have a ventilation system that's moving air in and out of that room, just like it would be in a classroom. So that goes really for all of our large spaces, cafeterias, gymnasiums, libraries, locker rooms. A lot of these larger rooms aren't quite as clear what's in them, but it is there. They do have a ventilation system.
Okay. There's a big question going around of, because we've shifted right now with just the awareness of COVID-19, and we will move out of COVID-19. Mike talked about it a little earlier around, we still have to consider we're constantly aware of where we are with our security measures. We have to be aware of, this is not all, our life is not all about COVID-19. We have other considerations and safety protocols that we need to follow. So there's a question here about, what about our interior classroom doors? Should they remain open or closed? What is the best way, and what do we do now? What are we supposed to do right now with our pressure box? And
yeah, well, from a ventilation standpoint, those should remain closed. Most of your hallway doors should be closed all the time. And I know there's a lot of different opinions and feelings out there with that, with teaching staff, educational staff that's working inside those spaces. But certainly for ventilation purposes, they should be. The hallway is a separate system. The other thing, just from a code perspective, is our hallways and our classrooms are generally separated for fire reasons, and fire code typically does not allow us to prop those doors open. They're different zones of the building, so they should be closed. And then if you throw in safety and security into the mix, I think their recommendations would be that those rooms are closed and locked in most cases.
So now I'm going to press a little bit further, because we have heard that if it's not too cold outside, to crack your window a little bit, to add a little fresh air, just like you shared, you're pumping in that fresh air. Should we be doing that? What should we be doing?
I would recommend against it for all the reasons we mentioned here. I mean, it is certainly in the CDC guidance to do some of that. If you read into the CDC and the ASHRAE guidance far enough, you'll find that they talk about that in areas where you have a lack of ventilation is usually where they talk about that. They make suggestions towards those things to overcome a lack of ventilation. And we should look differently at it than that. Our buildings have ventilation systems. They're working as designed. And if we find one that's not working as designed, it's our number one priority to fix that and make it work. So using an open window to the outside is, like I say, certainly falls in their guidance, but it is more for when you don't have ventilation. They have some recommendations around box, or potential recommendations. None of it, they kind of layer these things on top of each other around opening windows and putting box fans in them, one blowing out and one blowing in. Certainly effective at bringing in a lot of outside air and a lot of pollen and a lot of dust, stirring the dust up inside the room, or anything else that's inside the room. effective at moving outside air, but also very effective at making sure your room is the exact same temperature that it is outside, whether that be 45 or 95, and comes with just a lot of downside. So some of those guidances are just that. They're guidance, especially if you don't have good ventilation. And I feel confident that this district does have good ventilation. We've invested tens and hundreds of millions of dollars over the years in our ventilation systems.
Mike, it looks like you have a question or a comment to add to that.
I would just say amen, brother. I mean, it's one of those things where it's airflow is not ventilation, right? The ventilation systems are designed to do everything Joel had described earlier in the presentation, which is mixing of the air, which is going through the filtration system, which is having our systems monitor 1,000+ data points. And so that's not ventilation, that's airflow. And there's a difference, and we really tried to describe the difference a bit here. And so all I can say is, we're not going to have the window police running around making sure that windows are closed. So it's going to be individual calls, and if you open it, just know that you're taking on the responsibility of bringing in that outside air.
Yeah.
All right, I've got one more question, and then I'm going to do a quick wrap up, and I'll call on Rita. I'll have two of you wrap up, and then if Assistant Superintendent Sproles is still here, I'll have him do a quick wrap up. What about the disinfectants and the scent and the scent of the hand sanitizers when you're in an enclosed classroom with up to 18 individuals? That can become a pretty strong smell. And what about that? Does the ventilation move that quick enough? I'm gonna say probably not. So what is maybe it does. What is your input on that?
So our ventilation systems will dissipate that, as you mentioned, Mindy, because they're moving that air, they're taking air out of the space, bringing fresh air in. So over time, they will certainly dissipate that. I know that our district is very cautious in selection of chemicals and things that we allow in our buildings. In fact, we generally say no to most chemicals out there. So I know that our chemicals, our hand sanitizers, our cleaners, our disinfectants are heavily vetted by a lot of people in the district. I'm not personally directly involved with that work, but I know it happens. I work really close to David Hughes here in the facilities office. He's involved, Vonnie Good with our safety and risk management, and others are very involved in vetting anything and everything we bring in. So what I would say is yes, they do have scents, and we're aware of that. I don't know that there's much we can do about the scent as far as getting one without scent. These are vetted for safety, not only for their effectiveness and everything else, but that the scent isn't going to be, something that's toxic or anything like that. There's a lot of legwork goes into that. I'm imagining there are people out there who are sensitive to fragrances that may be sensitive to different, those, or cologne or whatever it may be. And those I think we'll have to deal with on a case-by-case basis as a district. But in general, we're providing good product, good safe product that's been looked at heavily.
I just want to say, I agree. I know that there was a really good calculation and decisions made as considerations of asthma and sense and all of that. And Vonnie, you might have something to share in that, but thank you, Joel. That was a great response. All right. Rita, any final thoughts on this for this evening?
Well, I want to thank you both, Mike and Joel. I know it was a short time frame to put this together. Mindy, thank you. But it's very, very helpful. And I just had one quick question, Joel, that I know our office staff have been asking about a lot, and that's for plexiglass. But could you just say why, how it keeps air and doesn't allow it to flow?
Yeah, I can speak to that. We've gotten those requests, a lot of requests for over the last year around plexiglass barriers. We've seen some ideas in classrooms that build, all the way around each individual kid. There's been a lot of talk around plexiglass, and our stance has stayed solid on that, with not wanting to install those for a lot of reasons. One is, the big one is around airflow. It's these spaces, we have, whether it be coming through the wall or coming through the ceiling, they rely on air movement from one side of the room or one area of the room back to the other side and coming back up in through this duct. So if we start building a lot of walls, which is really what that is a small wall, it prevents that airflow from happening. And you start to get really big pockets of hot air, cold air, whatever the problem is for that particular area, gets pocket inside this little space and doesn't have a really good way to get out. There's also, of course, that many more surfaces to clean and take care of. It's a big problem. We have some instances out there where we've had a lot of cubicles in spaces, in office spaces, where it's the full cubicle. They're 6-7 feet tall. They go all the way to the ground, and we have more problems for heating and cooling in those buildings than anywhere else. And that's what it comes down to, is we've built all of these. By putting all of that in, we've essentially built a ton of walls, and now the airflow is inhibited. So when we talk about the whole conversation today around ventilation and the movement of air, anything we put in its way only detracts from its ability to do its job, whether it be plexiglass or anything else. So,
well, thank you so much. And again, thank to everybody, those that put this together, as we work collaboratively to make sure that our staff and students are safe as we continue to bring more students back. Thank you.
thank you.
Rita.
Yeah, I just want to say, Joel, Michael, thank you so much for pulling this together. This presentation was fantastic. It's a lot of information, and we will work on getting some of these additional questions answered and put out to members. And so thankful and appreciative of your time and energy to be able to put this out to people. Thank you. Thanks for being here tonight. We appreciate it.
Yep, thanks a ton. And we'll be back. Just let us know when you're ready for round 2.
We will.
Okay.
Yeah,
You can
ventilation
count on it.
201, right?
Yeah, 201. You're gonna have a graduate degree by the time we're done.
I love it.
We'll be
Thank you.
certified.
All
Yeah, I
right.
was going to say, if we teach you too much, we'll be trying to hire you into our HVAC team. So be careful. So,
Sounds like a plan. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night. Thanks for coming.
Yes.
thank you, everybody.
Bye. Good night.